Hello everyone. I'm Conor Bailey, and I'm here today to give a quick presentation on Ireland's response to the Holocaust. But before I begin, I'd like to quickly just thank Lynn Jackson for inviting me to give this talk today, and indeed a thank you to all of the Holocaust Education Ireland organization. It's a great honor to be asked. And I'd also like to just thank Professor Fletchner, who was my dissertation supervisor, and a lot of the research that has gone into this talk was undertaken during my dissertation. So Roy was a big help. Um, yeah, so neutrality gone mad, Ireland's response to the Holocaust. This is a topic that hasn't really been covered in any great depth as a topic in its own right, or as an aspect of Ireland's experience during the war. And as a result, it can offer a lot of unique insights into Irish society during the time, um, the culture, and just the broader issue of how people react to a genocide and how they react to things that threaten to undermine or contradict a very rigidly built worldview. So, of course, Ireland was neutral during the war. There's a peaceful looking O'Connell Street in 1940. A small, insular, isolated nation at the edge of Europe. It was neutral. So Ireland had very little involvement with the war and less involvement with the Holocaust. There was only about 2,500, 3,500 Jewish people living on the island. So, it's obvious to say, but there was no invasion or occupation of the island. And of course, this meant there was no deportations or camps or ghettos established for the Jews of Ireland. And it's obvious, but it's just important that when Irish people did come to learn of the Holocaust, they were learning about it in a very detached way that wasn't directly tied or wasn't directly related to their experience or um their understanding of the war. And I'll get right into it by talking about this man on the left here, Robert Collis. Robert was a doctor from Dublin, and after the war, he volunteered with the British Red Cross in the Bergen-Belsen camp to establish a hospital for the hundreds of orphans in the camp. And he wrote about his experience and he described the horror that he found within the camp. He said, this small half square mile of soil held more suffering than had ever any spot on earth. There lay unburied more than 10,000 dried up, shriveled, bony remnants of mankind. So this is the type of imagery that Robert would have been exposed to in the camp, such as this mass grave here. So also at the camp was an Irish man serving in the English army, and he wrote a letter about what he found in the camp, and he describes how the victims had been killed in the coldest and most callous manner the human mind could devise, and how the indescribable horror was 20 times as bad as the images and the like that had been appearing in the media in Ireland. So, how did Irish people react to these impressions? This is an example of one of the first articles that appeared in Irish media about the horrors of the camps, and of course, they also would have heard things from Irish men in the English army, just like the previous quote. So, how did Irish people react to them? There's a person from Kilkenny. They wrote to their local newspaper after witnessing a newsreel image of the camps, and they dismissed it as English as the British using starving Indian actors to impersonate the camp victims, and dismissed it as propaganda. In Irish a politician called Luke Duffy in a debate in July 1945 in regard to the camps. He said, "We had a few of them in this country. A big number of people in the country are well aware of the nature of concentration camps. The less we say on that, the better for our peace of mind." Implying that Ireland had camps as well. So it was quite outrageous. Another person responding to the same images, as the person in Kilkenny wrote to their paper saying, "Why drag up all these unpleasant things?" Meaning images of the camps. It's so bad for the children. Life is bad enough without this beastliness. So most of the other responses that I found in my research echo this denial, disbelief, apathy, and treating the Holocaust as if it was something unpleasant to look at and nothing more, a very trivial sort of response. And of course, this all sounds quite outrageous to us today. But why were people in Ireland responding this way? And I think there are three main reasons. There's the historic distrust of Britain and the sort of um, uh, deep-rooted enmity towards Britain. There's a culture of isolationism which existed before the war, during the war, and indeed well after the war in Ireland. And then thirdly, there was the government's concept of a moralized policy of it being a neutral state. It wasn't just simply neutral because our army couldn't hope to really add anything, but it was a moralized version of it, which I will discuss more later. So the historic distrust of Britain. I use this image here. This is an image, of course, of the Black and Tans in Ireland because it's important to keep in mind that Ireland, as a free state, it was barely 18 years old at the outbreak of the war. So of course the generation of politicians in Ireland at the time, they were the same men who fought the British Army in the War of Independence or um and the like. So in the minds of most ordinary Irish people, the English were the natural enemies of the story, the natural enemies of history. And there's a very strong myth that the Irish experience under English rule was uniquely cruel, and there was nothing that could be described as being more cruel than what the English had done in Ireland. So in the days after the initial reports of the Belsen camp, there was a running debate in the Irish Times about the need to send over an Irish delegation to verify the English reports, since they couldn't possibly believe what the English army were saying because it was the English. They must be exaggerating. They must be lying. This couldn't be true. And I think I think Irish people just found it very difficult to accept that Britain could be on the right side of history, that Britain could be the morally righteous party. And I think that's one of the main reasons why people dismiss the reports as propaganda, because it would allow the English to say, look how righteous we are as an army, as a nation, and look how look how indefensible it was for Ireland to be neutral during such cruelty, which I think might help to explain those comments about people saying that they were using Indian, which of course is in it's not a justification, it's just an explanation. And it wasn't ubiquitous, this feeling. There was exceptions, of course. There's one letter in the Irish Times I found from a person who's sort of lamenting the rock-like apathy of Irish people. And he says the average Dubliner would not be persuaded, even though all the hosts of Hitler's enemies were to rise from the dead. He would only pour himself out another drink, muttering British propaganda. So, of course, there was also people who recognized this sort of naivety of just saying it's all English propaganda. Secondly, the pre-existing culture of isolationism. Now, speaking from Ireland in 2024, it's very hard to convey just how profoundly conservative interwar Ireland was, and how generally averse and hostile it was to anything mildly and just hostile to anything which undermined the very Irish, very conservative brand of Catholic morality. Um, from the very beginning of the state, there was a long relationship, a very deep-rooted relationship between the state and the power to ban to ban books, newspapers, magazines, pamphlets, movies, music, theater, play, anything that was a any piece of media which threatened to undermine public morality as they saw it was banned. So here we see a cartoon which has a not so subtle message towards what the author thinks modern novelists are doing, sort of wallowing in filth for the masses. There you can see it, the blacklist. This is the first books and uh, other magazines that were banned by the state. And of course, they don't sound very salacious. They don't sound very outrageous. Health and efficiency, the Sunday News, Peg's paper, probably quite harmless, but they would likely have been banned because they made reference to or they alluded to things like abortion or divorce or anything mildly associated with sex was just banned outright. Uh, from from 1929 to the end of the war, the state had banned 1,800 books, including just normal novels like The Grapes of Wrath and Brave New World. So it just gives you an idea of just how conservative the state really was in really there was this very deep-rooted need to prevent normal people from seeing things which might offend them. And of course, I have this image here to the side of De Valera next to the Archbishop Charles McQuaid, sort of a domineering person in the history of modern Irish history, and his influence over the state is something to be kind of debated and argued. But nonetheless, the the Constitution had a very strict conservative Catholic ethos to it. It established an education. Uh, of course, all the schools were run by the church. Divorce was banned, abortion was banned, and contraception was outright banned for a long time after the war as well. Um, and of course, there was also the state also had a very restrictive immigration policy, which meant that essentially zero Jewish refugees were admitted into the state during the refugee crisis of the 30s. So there was no influx of Jewish people into Ireland, and of course, then that meant there wasn't a lot of there was less of a personal element to tie the news of the camps to after the war. Uh, so Ireland's response to the Holocaust was defined in large part by this very closed, rigid, conservative system. And it was the same society that was still yet to undergo 6 years of a media blackout, essentially, during the war. Um, which only really removed it even more from the the ongoings of the war and of course all the crimes that were committed within it, including the Holocaust. So I don't think I think it's no great stretch to see how this society, who couldn't even tolerate allusions towards sex or divorce, and who saw no like obligation to help Jewish refugees, could be so unwilling to really reckon with images of mass graves filled with emaciated corpses and reports of gas chambers and torture and experimentation. I think for a lot of Irish people, the Holocaust was simply too offensive to really engage with, which sounds ridiculous, but I think that was one of the main reasons. And this led to comments from people like that one we heard before. Why drag up all these unpleasant things? It's bad to 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 learn about them. And this was commented on at the time. So the Irish Times published this report from Irish officers who visited the Bergen-Belsen camp. And one of them, in the letter, he's expressing his annoyance over this ignorance back home in Ireland. He says people in Ireland have been slow to believe such things. They need to be badly shaken. They have spun their own little cocoon and have been indifferent to a great extent to the sufferings of humanity. So it wasn't, even though Ireland was this isolated and conservative, there were people who were removed enough to actually acknowledge it. And I think more interestingly, De Valera, after the end of the war in late May, he responded to the growing number of reports like this and images like the ones we've seen, the very graphic images of camps. He responded to it by saying, now, essentially, now that the ban on those images was lifted, quote, what do you see? You see more atrocity pictures and so on, and are you any the better for seeing them? So kind of blatantly saying ignorance is bliss. You were better off not knowing these very uncomfortable things. You're better off just not knowing, which I think kind of really illustrates the Irish position. And the third factor that I think is very important is this moralized conception of neutrality. Ireland was neutral. It couldn't hope to really contribute in the war, but by implicitly framing the war as a sort of arbitrary power struggle between two or three equally immoral states, it elevated Ireland's neutrality to a sanctimonious expression of sort of moral righteousness that sort of implied Ireland was just too good to be dragged into the fight. We saw above it. We were better than those at war, and this had the unintended consequence of making the Holocaust seem like a trivial material cost of war. Um, so in that Irish Times debate about the need for an Irish verification of the camps, one person wrote how if Ireland was prepared to wash out other countries' dirty linen by publishing such reports, they ought to send reporters to China and Russia also in the interest of balance, as if to say the same type of crimes were being committed in China and Russia also. It was, of course, quite outrageous. In 1979, Frank Aiken, who was the minister for the coordination of the defensive measures, essentially he was in charge of what was allowed to be published in Irish media during the war. He stated in an interview in 1979 that in regard to the camps, he stated the Russians were as bad. You only have to look at what happened in Khitan Forest, which is a reference to when the NKVD murdered 23,000 Polish officers and buried the bodies, and the Germans uncovered the grave, as if to say that that crime was as bad as the Holocaust. And this persisted for quite some time as well. There was a letter to the editor in the Irish Times in 1982 that insisted the war was just a struggle for world power between two blocks, and the quote destruction of the destruction of European Jewry by one of those blocks was coincidental. So again, just making the Holocaust seem like a trivial thing that happened in a conflict that was sort of morally ambiguous, and Ireland was above it nonetheless. So uh, De Valera's quote there that I just mentioned, you see more atrocity pictures and so on, and are you any the better for seeing them? I think to him, reports of the Holocaust weren't really interesting in their own right, but they were rather just an inconvenient disturbance to the moral immunity that neutrality afforded Ireland during the war. As to openly acknowledge the inhumanity of the Holocaust would imply a contradiction to the very basis of Ireland's moralized conception of neutrality, as it would highlight Ireland's inaction during the war. It would highlight their inaction in the midst of such inhumanity, and it would implicitly paint the British as being morally righteous when compared to Ireland, which of course they couldn't really stomach at all. And this of course led to him going through with his meeting with the head of the German envoy in Ireland, Edward Hempel, who you can see here at the bottom. To express upon Hitler's death, he visited Hempel to express the state's condolences. A lot has been written about this meeting. Of course, it's quite a loaded incident in Irish history. It's everyone has their own views on it. But I do think that De Valera went through with this meeting not because he was sort of a secret Nazi or because he was a secret anti-Semite or he had some admiration for Hitler. I think it was he was so blinded by this concept of being a neutral party and being above the conflict that it simply took priority over opposition to the Holocaust. I think he was so blinded and so ignorant that he had to appear neutral, and that trumped everything else, including moral condemnation of the actions of Hitler and the German state. So this meeting sparked a lot of backlash. One New York resident wrote to De Valera saying, "Have you seen the motion pictures of the victims of German concentration camps, De Valera? Have you seen the crematoriums?" which De Valera, he had seen them, of course, by this point. He had even commented on them. And the New York Herald Tribune commented on the meeting. They said, "This is neutrality, surely it is a neutrality gone mad." So quite unambiguous there. But that was after the war. So what did Irish people know? What did ordinary Irish people know about the Holocaust as it was unfolding during the war? Well, they knew very little. They knew almost nothing, in fact. In the interest of defending the moralized conception of being a neutral state in the war, the Irish government enacted some of the most strict laws of any wartime neutral regarding what was allowed to be reported on in newspapers and what could appear in the printed press. And it essentially forbade any direct detail of any part of the conflict, and everything was reduced to sort of vague references, and things were referenced in a very ambiguous and general terms. So it was this was it was this strict for two main reasons. Firstly, it simply kept the temperature down for the government. They just didn't need any more issues as they saw it. They had enough issues to worry about. They didn't want any opposition appearing, any any threat to them as a government. And it also reduced accusations of the extent to which Ireland was actually helping the Allies, which of course was happening behind the scenes, and the Irish government did not want the Irish people to know that they were sending intel to the English army, etc. Um, but the one piece of direct evidence that I could find that it's the one piece of evidence that unambiguously shows that mass murder on an industrial scale was happening. It comes in the form of an American newsletter that was published by the legation in Dublin every month for the express purpose of getting around the Irish laws to show people what they weren't seeing in the newspapers. And the issue from September 1944 shows images of the recently liberated camp in Majdanek, which, and I don't have an image of the actual newsletter itself, so this is the closest one I could find. But indeed, the one in the newsletter is actually a lot more graphic. It shows um, the ovens here filled with bones. It shows dead bodies, etc. And it reports. It's only a one-page report with three or four images. Um, but the report states that such crimes were common that they were commonly known in Europe that didn't have such strict laws. So this sort of, and that's essentially it. The other leaks came from people who were serving in the English army, of course, like we've already heard from them, or people could access the BBC radio. They could buy English papers a few days after, but even then there was very little, very little reference or reports on the Holocaust in the English media. So you would very have to deliberately seek them out, and often even in England they gained very little traction. So I think this sort of scant and very kind of disparate pieces of evidence related of the Holocaust, and also just bits and pieces of a rumor of personal letters of things which they might have heard from people abroad about the Holocaust, amounts to a level of understanding which could be described as Babi Yar but not Auschwitz. So some historians use this term to talk about the level of German understanding of the Holocaust during the war. But I think it can be loosely applied to Ireland, where any understanding of the Holocaust that existed in Ireland at all, which would have been very scant and very small. Even those people who did know and did intentionally seek out this information would still only have an understanding that related to Babi Yar, like the massacre that happened in Babi Yar, the sort of a sort of unorganized massacre somewhere on the Eastern Front that wasn't part of a wider continent-wide policy of a systematic mass murder campaign with camps and with a bureaucracy, etc., such as was the case in Auschwitz. Um, in On the opposite side, the Irish state, they knew full well, I think, or they had a much broader understanding of what was going on than the Irish public. I think they saw something a lot closer to Auschwitz than to Babi Yar. In that same interview, Frank Aiken, who we heard from earlier, he said what was going on in the camps was pretty well known to us early on, and of course it would have been since he was in charge of viewing the initial reports and deciding what could and what could not be published. Him and his team would have seen firsthand the reports of camps and deportations and mass murders and so on throughout the war. And of course, De Valera, I'm sure, would have been privy to these reports as well. But he himself was kept informed through his through the Irish mission at the Holy See in Rome, and they were sort of they were awash with information coming in from all over Europe, from priests and diplomats and so on about the ongoings of the Holocaust, and De Valera requested such information from those links in the Vatican. But he was also continuously messaged by the former chief rabbi of Ireland, Rabbi Herzog, who knew De Valera well enough, and he kept him informed throughout the war, imploring him to intervene in any way, shape, or form that he could to intervene in cases of deportation or to try and help grant a group of Jews a visa, etc. Just using any cloud he had as Taoiseach. And he told in his uh, request to De Valera, he sort of says in no uncertain terms things like, quote, the American State Department announced 2 million European Jews perished and more threatened with extermination. Make supreme effort now to save Jews, imminent extermination. The Jews face utter annihilation in Nazi Europe and so on. So they're not very ambiguous. You can't really misread them. And De Valera was getting them all throughout the war. So I think it is fair to say that De Valera and at least his cabinet were quite aware. So I'd like to sort of wrap up now and talk about this man, Dennis Johnston. Dennis Johnston was an Irish writer, and he worked as a war reporter. He was from Dublin, and he worked as a war reporter with the BBC, and he was sort of attached to the English Army. And he was one of the first to report on the liberated camp in Buchenwald. And he later wrote a memoir of his time as a reporter, and sort of it's half fact, half fiction. It's sort of ambiguous as to what was actually his experience during the war. But in it, he offers two versions of an ending scene to the book, which I think uh, the I think they illustrate this overall issue of Ireland's response to the Holocaust. So in one of the versions of the ending scene, Johnston offers to shoot a German officer who was caught trying to flee a camp and sort of escape justice. But the German officer takes Johnston's gun and shoots him. In the second version of the ending, Johnston arrives too late to the scene, having just witnessed the officer kill himself. So it's sort of ambiguous what this really means, what Johnston was getting at. But historian Claire Wills describes this as the unresolved problem of neutrality, atrocity, guilt, and moral engagement that many Irish people felt after they saw the horrors within the camps in person or indeed through the media. And Johnston, he was an Irish man, but he was working with the English Army. He felt guilt at having ever felt neutral about this. He felt guilt at being Irish, coming from a country that was neutral, and not only was neutral, but even after the fact they were exposed to this evidence, they seemed to not care. And so it's sort of really, I think this problem of guilt and atrocity and responsibility, it only really applies to people like Johnston who were actually willing to engage with the reality of what happens in the camps and what happens in the Holocaust, and to really seriously reckon with the implications that it had for the Irish worldview, the Irish experience, and for morality overall. And sadly, um, most Irish people at this time simply were just not willing to engage with that. Just it was just too uncomfortable. It threatened most parts of the worldview of their morality and so on. And so I think most Irish people simply did not care. So I'd just like to wrap up now, and I'll just say one last thing. I think it's interesting that people in Ireland, they had to wait until the end of the war to be met with this evidence of crimes against humanity and genocide. So they were there was a media blackout, and then they learned of it all. But today, that's sort of impossible with the internet. And today, people are continuously you almost can't escape graphic evidence of ongoing crimes against humanity and genocide that's happening in the world today. So but still people, much like people in Ireland during this period, uh, people still meet this evidence with a sort of apathy or disinterest or denial or complacency in some cases. So a lot of things have changed, but history shows us that some things that ought to change don't really change. So I'll just leave it at that. And again, I'd like to thank everyone for listening to my talk. And again, thank you to Holocaust Education Ireland for having me today. Thank you very much.